education hires a lot of consultants. In athletics, the consulting business is booming. There are search consultants, financial consultants, gender equity consultants, consultants to evaluate coaching effectiveness, and marketplace strategy consultants, just to name a few. As the number of available high school athletes begins to dwindle in the next decade, small and medium sized schools are looking for a strategy to survive and thrive. Consider Western Michigan University as an example. Their enrollment is dropping, Westerns by 5% in 1 year and 10% over 3 years. The Detroit Free Press reported in December that thanks to data collection, Western knows when prospective students choose to attend other schools. They know that 21% choose to attend Michigan State and 18% have chosen to attend Grand Valley State. While it might make sense to make Western look more like Michigan State, their vice president of enrollment told the faculty and staff, "Not so fast. We can't be Diet MSU, and we have to change the perception that we are, quote unquote, a backup school." They hope their next big idea will resonate, a place where students can explore careers, define passions, and be cared for holistically. Painting a realistic financial forecast is essential for any trustee to have in front of them, and having an outside pair of eyes can go a long ways towards dealing with the reality square head on. Today I am joined by Lucie Lapovsky. She is an economist who consults, writes, and speaks widely on issues related to higher education finance, pricing, strategy, and governance. Her recent clients included Pitzer Colleges, Agnes Scott, the College of Worcester, and several others. In addition, she is actively engaged in research on price resets, tuition discounting, and cost containment. She also served as the president of Mercy College in New York. She'll help us understand exactly how institutions decide to add athletic programs and the financial calculus they are making in doing so. And we have Lucie Lapovsky today with us, who's the principal at Lapovsky Consulting. And we've been talking a little bit about small colleges and athletics. And Lucie, I know you've had a background as a college president, a college CFO. And so I also assume that your consultancy work includes small colleges. I'd like to zero in on that today, especially as it relates to athletics, especially as it relates to recruitment, retention, and graduation of all students. So you were just telling me about a situation at Goucher that might be great for folks to hear about.
Oh, well, I was seeing that when I went to Goucher. Goucher had a riding team, and my predecessor had decided it probably should be eliminated because it was quite costly. The horses cost a lot of money to keep, and they had their own facilities, etc. And when I went and looked into it before moving on his recommendation, I found a few things. Number one, the riding attracted many full-pay students to the college, which, as you know, today are rarer and rarer to find. But riding is a sport that the wealthier tend to do. So that was something that was very advantageous to us. And there is a correlation between socioeconomic status and academic ability. So they tended to be many of our better students as well. In addition, it turned out that the community liked our riding program, and many people in the community boarded horses at the college. And so it bred good relationships. So rather than eliminating the program, we actually expanded it, added an indoor ring, and enhanced its popularity. And 30 years later, it's still thriving at Goucher, and the school is winning awards and has a great team. So you never know, although it in of itself cost money and was expensive, it had other benefits that were indirectly tied to it, and all depends on how you do the analysis in terms of how you assess whether a sport is advantageous financially or disadvantageous.
Right, right. So, and you also mentioned to me that you kind of expanded even the community on campus who appreciated riding as well, right?
Right, both the people on campus as well as the people in the neighborhood
Mm-hmm.
who not only boarded their horses, sent their children for teaching there. We also, at least when I was there, had a special a program for children with special needs where we did riding for them. and taught them writing, and also was able to help our education students in doing that, and was great work study for many of our students. But beyond that, the community who supported writing in the area were also generous contributors often to the college. So, it had a lot of external benefits, as well as, enhancing and recruitment of certain types of students.
Sure, absolutely. Well, that leads us into the main topic of our discussion today, which is really what to me seems like the beginning of a trend in enrollment stabilization for small colleges and universities today that know they're fighting the demographic shifts, that they know that the number of students coming out of high schools over the next several years will continue to decline. And they know that in order to even have a chance at attracting some of those students, they need to have a very robust athletics program. So because of that, they're adding more sports. And it's unusual to me because I've seen a lot of cost cutting over the years and sports have been dropped. At the small college level, this seems to be reversed. Could you walk us through how a small college structures its budgets, its campus-wide budgets, and even how 50 new athletes could make a difference to a college?
Sure. Well, I mean, structuring your budgets is a tough one. Most of the schools today, you start with a budget and you add or subtract from it, depending on what your revenue projections are. And they look at their enrollment projections. They look at what their tuition is, but much more important than their tuition is what their net tuition, because today the average private college has what we call a discount rate of over 50%. Which means that students, if your published price is 30,000, on average, they're collecting about 14,000 per student. So that's the much more important piece of data. So when you look at a small, and so they have to figure out how much revenue they'll have to decide how much they can support in their expenses. And as enrollment has been going down at many schools, and as the discount rate has been going up, the challenge these schools have had has been to maintain the infrastructure that they have with less revenue. And so two things are happening. They're becoming more and more efficient as they can, but many have, as we call it, cut to the bone. So their other alternative is to develop other sorts of revenue. And so those schools that have primarily been full-time undergraduate in the past are developing part-time programs, graduate programs, relationships with business, and other sorts of things to diversify their revenue. But in order to bulk up or increase and maintain their full-time undergraduate enrollment, schools are looking to adding new programs, and many are adding a lot of academic programs, primarily in the health sciences and cyber, where there's market demand, but also adding programs in athletics. And a new athletic program can often add many students to your school, and the schools are in search of bringing in more students and being more attractive to students, differentiating themselves in the market. And so, some schools will look to expanding existing sports, adding a JV or other things there. You don't usually have facility demands the same way you may in adding a new sport. Now, a few schools will add football because that's a very expensive sport, but there are many other sports which you can use facilities that are already in place or don't have expensive facility needs. And so schools look to adding those types of sports. Among the small schools, they're either Division 1 or 2, Division 2 or 3, usually in the NCAA. Division 2, you can give athletic scholarships. Division 3, you can't. Yet most of our students in most schools, everyone gets financial aid. So it doesn't necessarily make a great deal of difference whether the scholarship can be for athletics or whether it's just a what I call characteristic based or merit scholarship based on the characteristics the student has. So a school can decide to add a sport, and they will assess how many students the sport will take, what is a full team, how many students it's likely to increase. They'll hire a coach. And yes, you asked me about coaches' responsibilities. Coaches, besides having to run a team, operate a team, They also are usually charged with admission expectations to bring in the students. They recruit their team. And so a coach is an adjunct to the admission staff in all ways in terms of helping the admission staff increase recruitment of students. One thing about adding sports is we find that most of our schools, the athletes have higher retention rates than students who aren't attached to a sport, in part because they are more attached to the school. They have a quote advisor being their coach who stays close to them, often watches over what they're doing, their academics. Many will run study halls and other things. So at many schools, the athletes perform as well or better than the average students in terms of the academics. So bringing in another athlete will lead to, over the 4 or 5 years they're there, a long-term investment. So I just played with some numbers. If you, for example, have a sport where you bring in 50 students, and I'm just making the assumption you bring in a whole team of freshmen, a whole team of freshmen right away, you can those students will assume at a school that has maybe a 50 or 60% graduation rate, those students are likely to have a 70% graduation rate. So those 50 students over 5 years, today, unfortunately, too many of our students are taking 5 years, will give you 183 student years, so to speak. And those, if this school, for example, charged $28,000 in tuition and had a 53% discount rate, they would bring in per year, their annual would be about, let's see, 14,000, and then you have room and board. That's the other piece. Most athletes will live on campus, so if they pay 8,000 in room and board, they'll bring in 23,000 a year per student. And so just in the first year, 50 students can bring you $1.15 million. And that cohort of 50 students, you'll ultimately graduate 35 of them. And over 5 years, you bring in $4.2 million in additional revenue from this group of students. And each year you would get to bring in some more students to fill up your team. And then you asked me about, so, bringing in these 50 students is going to cost you something. And it varies. Part of it depends on how close to capacity the school is. If the school isn't at capacity, then it's unlikely you'll need to add any faculty or student service support staff. So your only additional cost would be the direct cost for whatever the team was. And you probably would need a coach, maybe an assistant coach. You would need the food that those students would consume, because that's the only variable cost in terms of their room and board, their board cost. I'm making the assumption that you have vacant dorm residence hall rooms and vacancies in your class, and then some operating expenses for your for the team, the bus, the supplies, the uniforms. So it could cost you a year as little as about $260,000 to add a team, and they're bringing in over $1 million in revenue. So you can see it's a very winning strategy. You then asked me, what about facilities? What if it needs a new facility? There are a couple of things. Oftentimes you can use facilities that are there, or you can, for a low cost, rent space. For example, if you're adding a golf team, you're not likely to build a golf course. You'll use a neighboring golf course. And some of your sports can use what you have, your fields and everything that may already be there. If you have to add a facility, then you figure out what your facility cost will be to build it. And usually you will fund it through bonds. And so you'll pay for it over, a 20, 30, or 40-year period. So your cost per year is not particularly high. And athletic facilities often are attractive to donors. So you're likely to be able to get gifts to be able to support the facility.
Well, yeah, I have a lot of questions from all that, but that's really helpful just to kind of walk us through the basic thinking process of how this comes to fruition. But here's my question. As we know that the number of high school students are going to be slowing down, and there's going to be more competition for those same athletes. Let's say there's competition for women's soccer or men's soccer or swimming or other kinds of sports that have traditionally been, I would say, middle to upper middle academic preparation and probably athletic achievement. How do you then, if every school is thinking in the plan that you're proposing, this is all we need to provide and at this cost, how do then schools differentiate themselves in a very competitive recruiting market?
They have to differentiate themselves. Well, a couple of things. First, a school is likely to see where there's some unmet need. If they look among their peers and the types of students they're likely to attract, what sports, if any, do they are not offered um, by the schools around them. So, for example, there are some schools in California that are looking at adding lacrosse. Apparently, lacrosse is not a big sport out in California. So they're looking at adding it and recruiting more in the East Coast, places where lacrosse is a big draw. So, clearly you don't want to replicate what your neighbors have. So that's certainly one thing. But at the end of the day, students choose based on the academic programs, their relationship to the coach, whether there's a connection, if they're an athlete, between the student and the coach, and the value proposition of the school. How do they perceive what that school has to offer versus what they need versus what they're going to have to pay for it?
Yeah, yeah. I also think you made a really important point about the room and board. I don't think enough cost analysis goes into that. If you have empty beds, you've got to find a way to fill those beds as quickly as you can because that's a lost opportunity. So, are there any strategies around, besides recruiting athletes, around trying to fill those beds in other schools that are struggling with enrollment?
Well, there are some schools that are offering highly discounted rates for rooms for students, locally, to encourage them to live on campus. So you give, special room and board scholarships if you live within 25 or 30 miles of the school, in order to fill up the dorms. Because not only is it lost revenue, but it also impacts the quality of life. If your dorms are too empty, there's not the residential life that you want there. There's making residence halls more attractive, offering more activities in them. Many schools are going to living learning communities, special dorms, language houses, special interest houses, all sorts of things that will make the school and the residence hall more attractive. And then schools that are actually having major issues with unmet empty beds will try to rent to other schools that have shortages.
Well, and I've seen that in the Philadelphia area. I've seen that model replicated a number of times. Now, I've also seen a number of campuses who don't have residence halls, but are still electing to add sports, particularly at the community college level. Can
Mhm.
you talk about that strategy?
I'm not an expert on that, but clearly community colleges are vying for students as well as everyone else. Community colleges have a retention issue, and we know that students involved in sports are much more likely to be retained. And so I think from a community college point of view, number one, it enhances the value proposition of the community college if it's offering, more student activities. It'll make the school more attractive to other students who like watching the sports. And it's also likely to bring in students who will stay, complete the 2 years, and then transfer on to a 4-year school. And many 4-year schools are doing a lot of recruiting at community colleges.
Yes, and a lot of articulation agreements as well.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really like the idea that Goucher brought to the table, which was the idea of doing horse riding and all the opportunities it created for them. I think that's a real win-win opportunity when you're as a college trying to think outside the box using athletics. As you're right, lacrosse is a fast-growing sport in this country, and I'm wondering if there's enough high school participation to keep up with the number of colleges that are adding lacrosse, because it seems to be exploding?
I have no idea, but I'm sure high schools will respond to what's attractive at colleges. There's no doubt high school students want to make themselves more attractive to colleges. We know that at the most elite colleges, for example, star athletes who are academically talented but not the top of the class will often get into the top schools over the students at the top of the class. And so, if lacrosse is what's growing and your school doesn't have it, there'll probably be a push to add it so that students can add it to their resumes.
Absolutely. Well, Lucie, I really want to thank you for taking some time to talk with me and my listeners about this very important topic in higher education, because I just see a continuing advancement of more and more sports participation opportunities as a result of this demographic shift. So thank you.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it, Karen.
Excellent.
Take care.
You too. While we can plan for the estimated costs of adding teams to stabilize or grow enrollment, we have to plan just as effectively to cover athlete medical care. Too many times we expect that athletes are fully covered under their parental medical plans. In today's landscape, that could be a very expensive misunderstanding for the athlete. Colleges have long skirted the rules for who is responsible for the bills not covered by insurance. Last week I wrote a story in Forbes.com about Sedona Prince, a University of Oregon women's basketball player who was stuck with $22,000 in medical bills because of an injury she sustained while playing basketball. She posted this on Twitter. Quote, "I usually don't like to open up about a personal subject like this, but I feel like it needs to get the attention it deserves. Due to my injury last year, I received a call informing me of the $22,000 I owe in medical bills, which has now gone to collections. As a 19-year-old collegiate basketball player, no one should have to go through this, especially since I was under the care of my institution during the time of the hospital visit. The university I now attend is unable to pay this debt because of NCAA rules, and I am now deeply saddened that I will carry this burden for the rest of my life. No student athlete should ever have to struggle with this or walk away with debt from playing the sport they love. I hope my past experience opens the eyes of many and prevents other student athletes from falling victim to the negligence that I have experienced." Unquote. As NCAA rules stand, she is not permitted to receive funds from any GoFundMe accounts established by fans and supporters. She is stuck with these bills, despite doing everything asked of her and suffering a tragic, nearly career-ending injury. This situation reminds me of Shabazz Napier, the University of Connecticut point guard who famously said in the 2014 Final Four, "I go to bed at night hungry," to a worldwide audience. He made it plain that inequities exist for athletes being pushed to their physical limits and what the gaps are in the NCAA legislation. This moment is no different. I see this as a potentially galvanizing moment for the NCAA to address the issue of covering athletically related medical expenses too. No athlete in a Power 5 conference should be left with medical bills, especially a school like the University of Texas, where Prince attended first, with a $200 million budget and has just 20 varsity sports to support. The need of change the NCAA made after Napier's comments was nearly breathtaking. Less than 1 month later, schools were permitted to pay for additional meals and snacks. The same thing should happen for Sedona Prince and for others. Many people have lumped this issue in with quote-unquote pay for play for college athletes. I view it differently. It should be viewed as delivering on a promise to take care of those we bring to campus and call a member of our quote-unquote family. You can read more about Sedona Prince and her situation by clicking on the link in the episode epilogue.